In Lee County, Georgia, in the southwest corner of the state, there is a piece of land that has changed hands in a way that is almost too neat to believe, except that every part of it is documented. For most of the 19th century, part of that land was a plantation, owned, by one account, by the largest slaveholder in the state of Georgia, one of the richest men in it. Black people were held there as property. They worked that ground and were buried in it and never had the faintest expectation of owning any of it. Today, that same land is owned and farmed by the descendants of enslaved people. That is the ending of this story, and I am telling it to you first, because you need to know that it is coming, that somewhere at the end of all of this there is a piece of justice so precise it looks like it was arranged. Hold on to it. Because between here and there is one of the most infuriating stories in modern American history, the rise of the largest black-owned farm the United States has ever had, and the slow, deliberate, bureaucratic murder of it, not by a mob, not by fire, but by the quiet decision made in government offices to let it die of thirst. This is the story of new communities. It begins in the 1960s, in the middle of the civil rights movement, in the most dangerous part of it, in the part of Georgia where standing up could cost you everything. Southwest Georgia was hard country for the movement. This was the region of the Albany movement, the long, grinding campaign to break segregation in the early 1960s, and one of the men at the center of it was a young minister named Charles Sherrod. He was the first field secretary the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee ever had. He came into Southwest Georgia in 1961 and he stayed, and he was beaten and jailed more times than most people could stand, and he kept going, organizing black Georgians to register to vote and to desegregate the schools. But there was a part of the work that troubled him deeply, and it is the seed of this entire story. Because Charles Sherrod was asking black people to stand up, to register, to march, to send their children to white schools. And over the people who listened to him paid a specific price for it. They were sharecroppers and tenant farmers. They lived and worked on land owned by white men. And when a black family registered to vote, or signed their kids up for a white school, or was simply seen at a movement meeting, the white landlord would throw them off the land. They lost their homes and their livelihoods in the same afternoon. Whole families, evicted with nowhere to go because they had exercised the rights Sherrod was urging them to claim. He was, he later said, telling people to stand up while watching them lose everything for doing it, and he began to think that political rights without economic ground to stand on were a trap. What good was the right to vote if asserting it left you landless and hungry? The answer he and others arrived at was black-owned land. Land that no white landlord could evict anyone from, because black people would own it outright, together, and no one could throw them off ground that was theirs. In 1968, a group of these activists did something that tells you how serious they were. They traveled to Israel to study the kibbutz, the collective farm, communally owned and worked, self-sufficient. They wanted to see how a community could hold land in common and sustain itself, and they came back to Georgia with a model. In 1969, they founded New Communities Incorporated. Charles Sherrod became its president. His wife, Shirley Sherrod, who would herself become a central figure in this story and decades later a nationally known one, was part of it from the beginning. And in January of 1970, after borrowing over $1 million, New Communities took possession of the land, around 3,000 acres of farmland and more than 2,000 acres of woodland, 5,700 acres in all. It was, at that moment, the largest single tract of land owned by black people in the United States of America. Let that fact sit for a second, because it is the thing the rest of the story is going to destroy. In a country where black people had been brought specifically to work land they could never own, where a century of sharecropping and tenant farming and legal trickery had kept black families landless generation after generation, a group of civil rights activists in South Georgia had assembled the biggest black-owned farm in the nation. It was also the first community land trust in America, a legal structure new to this country in which the land is held in common and permanently so that it can never be individually sold off or lost. They had built it precisely so that it could not be taken. To understand why land mattered so much, why these activists fixed on it as the answer, you have to understand what was happening to black land in America at the time, because it was vanishing. At the start of the 20th century, black Americans had owned something on the order of 15 to 16 million acres of farmland, 1 million black farmers working ground that was theirs. By the time Charles Sherrod was organizing in Southwest Georgia, that number had been falling for decades and would keep falling. Black families losing land through every mechanism a hostile society could devise, from violence to fraud to the tangle of inheritance laws to the simple, grinding denial of the credit that farming requires. The men and women who founded new communities were not acting in the abstract. They were watching black land disappear around them in real time, and they were trying to build something big enough and permanent enough to stand against the tide. That was the ambition behind the Community Land Trust. The idea was borrowed and adapted, but the purpose was specific to their situation: land held collectively and permanently, in a legal structure designed so that it could never be picked off parcel by parcel, never individually mortgaged into oblivion, never lost the way black families had been losing land for generations. It was, in effect, a fortress built out of a deed. They were trying to make land that could not be taken, and for the first time in America, they built one. And it was meant to be a haven. The whole point of new communities was to take in the families who had been thrown off white men's land for joining the movement, to give the dispossessed a place that was theirs, where they could farm and work and live and not be evicted for being black and standing up. Dozens of families, a working farm, homes, a store, a community, built by the movement. For the people, the movement had cost everything. They planted, they farmed, they raised crops on thousands of acres, and for a while, it worked, but it was surrounded from the first day by people who wanted it gone. You have to understand where this land sat. This was southwest Georgia, a few years after the Albany movement, in a region where a great many white people had watched the civil rights movement with fury and had lost. And now, right in the middle of their county, was the largest black-owned farm in America, run by the very SNCC organizer who had led the local movement, populated by black families who had defied the old order. To the white power structure of that region, New Communities was not just a farm, it was an insult standing in a field. So they went after it, and they went after it from every direction at once. The hostility started at the top of the state. Georgia's governor at the time was Lester Maddox, a man who had become nationally famous a few years earlier for brandishing an axe handle to keep black customers out of his Atlanta restaurant. A segregationist to the marrow. And Maddox used the power of the governor's office against New Communities directly. Federal development funds that were supposed to flow to the project, money that had been approved to help build it, Maddox blocked from entering the state. The governor of Georgia personally reached into the machinery and cut off the money meant to help the largest black-owned farm in the country get on its feet. That was the official hostility. There was also the other kind. White neighbors accused the people of New Communities of being communists. A collective farm modeled on a kibbutz was, to them, all the proof they needed. And the accusation was not just talk. The communist accusation deserves a moment because it was not random and it was not harmless. In the American South of that era, to call something communist was to mark it for destruction. It was the word that turned a target into a legitimate one, that justified surveillance, funding cutoffs, and violence. A collective farm, owned in common, modeled on an Israeli kibbutz, run by Sneesi activists, to the white power structure of southwest Georgia, every one of those facts was ammunition. They did not have to argue that black people should not own land. They could simply call the largest black-owned farm in America a communist enterprise and let the word do the work of making its destruction seem like patriotism. The farm's buildings were at times strafed with gunfire. People shot at the place. Racist violence came at them out of the dark, aimed at the structures where families lived and worked. They built and farmed under the knowledge that the surrounding county wanted them gone and that some of the people around them were willing to shoot to make it happen. And then there were the banks. Local banks often simply refused to finance them, refused the ordinary loans and credit that every farm in America runs on, because farming is a business of borrowing against the next harvest. A farm that cannot get credit is a farm operating with one hand tied behind its back, and the banks around New Communities kept that hand tied. So here is the picture by the mid-1970s. The largest black-owned farm in America, built as a refuge for people the movement had made landless, was operating under blocked state funds, sporadic gunfire, and a local financial system that would not lend to it. And it was surviving anyway. Struggling, carrying heavy debt from the loans it had taken to buy the land in the first place, but surviving. And then the rain stopped. In the 1970s, southwest Georgia was hit by drought. And drought is the thing that can kill any farm, anywhere, no matter how well run, because a farm is a bet on water falling from the sky, and when it stops falling, the crops fail and the debt does not. But American agriculture had long since built a safety net for exactly this. When drought struck, farmers went to the government, specifically to the Farmers' Home Administration, the federal agency that lent to rural farmers, and they got emergency loans to carry them through the disaster until the rains returned and the crops came back. This was routine. This is what the agency existed to do. White farmers all across the drought region were going to the Farmers' Home Administration and getting emergency loans one after another and staying on their land. New communities went to the same office to ask for the same help that every other farmer in the region was getting. Shirley Sherrod later described what happened when they went to the local Farmers' Home Administration office to apply for the emergency loan. An official there told her, and she has quoted his words many times since because they are not the kind of words a person forgets, that she would get a loan there over his dead body. Over his dead body. Read what that sentence actually means. Emergency disaster loans were available. White farmers were getting them. The program existed precisely to keep farms alive through droughts exactly like this one. And a federal official administering a federal program with federal money looked at the representative of the largest black-owned farm in America and told her that she would receive that help only over his dead body. It was not that the money did not exist. It was that he would not let it reach them. The safety net that was catching every white farmer in the region was deliberately held out of reach of the black one. That refusal was the beginning of the end, and it launched new communities into a 3-year legal battle that they would ultimately lose. Because you cannot fight a drought without water, and you cannot fight it without credit either, and they had been denied both. The sky gave them no rain, and the government gave them no loan. The crops could not be saved. The debt could not be paid. The heavy borrowing they had taken on to buy 5,700 acres in the first place, combined with years of drought, combined with a government that would help every farmer around them but not them, closed like a vice. There is something worth pausing on in the pure administrative cruelty of it. A mob that burns a farm has to look at what it is doing. It has to strike the match. The man in the Farmers' Home Administration office did not have to do any of that. He sat at a desk in a government building with the authority to approve a form that would have kept a farm alive, and he declined to approve it. That was the whole act. No smoke, no fire, no crowd. Just a decision, made in a chair, to let the drought finish what the decision started. The violence of it was total, and it left no mark that a photograph could capture. That is precisely why it worked, and precisely why it was so hard to fight. You cannot show a jury a burning building when the weapon was an empty chair where a signature should have been, and they did try to fight it. The denial launched new communities into a 3-year legal battle to force the help they were owed. But a farm cannot wait 3 years for a courtroom. A farm lives and dies by seasons, and every season the loan did not come was a season of crops that failed and debt that grew. They were fighting on a legal timeline for the survival of something that ran on an agricultural one, and the two did not match, and the farm was dying the whole time the case was pending. They started selling land to survive. In the early 1980s, they were forced to sell off around 1,300 acres trying to stay alive. It was not enough. The debt kept crushing down, the loans that could have saved them never came, and the first lien holder moved to foreclose. In 1985, new communities lost everything. The land was foreclosed and sold, by one account, sold for a fraction of its real value, a fifth of what it was worth, and the families who had built their lives there, the dispossessed people, who had come to this place precisely because it was supposed to be the one piece of ground no one could take from them, were displaced again. The refuge built for the evicted ended by evicting them. 15 years after it began as the largest black-owned farm in America, New Communities was gone. And here is the thing to understand about how it died, because it is the whole point. New Communities was not destroyed by a mob in a single night, the way black towns had been destroyed in earlier decades. It was not burned. There was no massacre. It was killed slowly, on paper, in offices, by officials making quiet decisions about who would and would not receive the ordinary help the government gave to everyone else. It was strangled by the withholding of things, withheld development funds, withheld bank credit, withheld emergency loans. Each individual decision could be defended as a technicality, a matter of paperwork, a judgment call. Add them all together and they killed the largest black-owned farm in the country as surely as any fire ever burned a town. The people who ran New Communities knew exactly what had happened to them. They knew the loans that saved their white neighbors had been denied to them because they were black. And for a long time, knowing it changed nothing, because knowing a thing and being able to prove it in a way the law would recognize are two different things. And the law had never been built to hear them. But this time, the story does not end with the loss. This time, there was a second act, and it took more than 20 years to arrive. Because New Communities was not the only one. Across the American South, for decades, black farmers had been going to the United States Department of Agriculture and its lending agencies and being denied the loans, the credit, the disaster relief, and the basic services that white farmers received as a matter of routine. It was a pattern, national in scale, stretching back generations, a slow bleeding of black families off their land through the quiet machinery of discriminatory lending. The number of black-owned farms in America collapsed across the 20th century, and a great deal of that collapse was not accident or market forces. It was policy, executed one loan denial at a time. In 1997, that pattern finally became a lawsuit. It was called Pigford versus Glickman, a class action brought by black farmers against the USDA for exactly this, decades of racial discrimination in federal farm lending. And it became one of the largest civil rights settlements in the history of the United States, more than $1 billion eventually, paid out to thousands of black farmers who had been discriminated against by their own government. New Communities was part of it. And when the claims were finally settled, New Communities received the largest single award of them all, around $12 million, in recognition of what had been done to it. The Sherrods themselves received a payment for their own pain and suffering. The government had, at last, been forced to admit in a court of law that the largest black-owned farm in America had been discriminated against, that the thing everyone involved had always known was true was, in fact, true. Money is not land. $12 million did not give back the 15 years, or the 5,700 acres, or the community that had been scattered in 1985. You cannot unforeclose a farm. You cannot undisplace the families. The refuge that was destroyed stayed destroyed. But New Communities, the organization, had never dissolved. Through all the years after the foreclosure, the Sherrods and the others had kept the corporation alive, refusing to let it die even after its land was gone. And so, when the settlement money came, they were still there to receive it, and they did the one thing that could turn a check into a kind of resurrection. They bought land again. In June of 2011, using the settlement money, New Communities purchased a new property in Lee County, Georgia, around 1,600 acres. And of all the land in Georgia they could have bought, the land they bought was this, a place called Cypress Pond, a former plantation, complete with a colossal white-pillared antebellum mansion, land that had once been owned, by the accounts that survive, by the largest slaveholder in the state of Georgia, one of the richest men in it, a place where human beings had been held as property and worked to enrich the man who owned them. The descendants of enslaved people bought the plantation of the largest slaveholder in Georgia. Shirley Sherrod said it plainly, standing on that land years later. Many of the enslaved, she pointed out, had probably worked on that very property, and had surely never imagined a day when black people would own and control it. It had gone, in her words, from a bad beginning, which was slavery, to the descendants of slaves. The mansion the slaveholder built now sat on land held by the people his kind had once held. They renamed the working farm Resora, a name meant to carry the idea of resilience, of resourcefulness, of coming back, and they began, again, to farm. Today that land grows pecans by the hundreds of acres, and satsuma oranges, and muscadine grapes, and vegetables raised in part to feed people in the surrounding area who do not have enough to eat. New Communities is a farm again, and a center for the training and support of black farmers, and a place of what Shirley Sherrod calls the long movement, the work that did not end when the marching stopped, the work of putting black families back onto black-owned land. So that is the arc, start to finish. A group of civil rights activists, watching black families get thrown off white men's land for daring to claim their rights, decided the answer was land of their own, land no one could evict them from. They built the largest black-owned farm in America and the first community land trust in the country as a refuge for the dispossessed. And the state of Georgia and the federal government, working through a segregationist governor and a federal lending office in a drought they refused to help with, strangled it slowly until it died and its families were scattered. Then, more than 20 years later, The same government was forced by the largest civil rights settlement in its history to admit what it had done, and with that admission, the survivors bought back land, and the land they bought was a slaveholder's plantation, and now the descendants of the enslaved farm the ground the enslaver once owned. It would be easy to end there, on the reversal, because the reversal is real, and it is remarkable, and it is the kind of ending that feels like the moral arc of the universe finally bending the right way. But it is worth being honest about the shape of the whole thing, because the reversal is smaller than the loss, and pretending otherwise would betray the people it happened to. New Communities was 5,700 acres. Resorab is 1,600. The families who were displaced in 1985 did not get their 15 years back. The refuge that was supposed to be permanent, that was legally structured as a community land trust, specifically so that it could never be lost, was lost anyway, because no legal structure yet invented can protect land from a government that decides quietly to withhold the water of credit until the thing dies of thirst. The comeback is genuine. It is also a fraction of what was taken, arriving a quarter century late, purchased with the settlement of a wrong that should never have needed settling. And New Communities was one case. The $1 billion of the Pigford settlement was paid out to thousands of black farmers, which means there were thousands of new communities. Thousands of black families and farms across the American South bled off their land by the same machinery, most of them never famous, never the largest anything, never resurrected by a settlement, just gone. The disappearance of black-owned farmland across the 20th century, from millions of acres to a small fraction of that, was not weather, and it was not the free market. A great deal of it was exactly what happened at New Communities, repeated tens of thousands of times in offices, on paper, one denied loan at a time. That is the thing to carry out of this. The destruction of black towns by fire and mob, the Pierce Cities, the Rosewoods, the Ocoees, is horrifying and visible, a thing you can point to, a single night with a body count. What happened to New Communities is the same crime committed in a way that leaves no smoke. No one burned it. No one had to. They simply decided in a government office that the help every other farmer received would not reach this one, and then they let the sky do the rest. It is slower, and it is quieter, and it is, in its way, harder to see, and it moved far more black families off far more land than any mob ever did. The land in Lee County remembers all of it. It was a slaveholder's plantation. Then for a while, it was not part of the story at all. And then the descendants of the enslaved, having built the largest black farm in America a few miles away and watched their government strangle it, took the settlement money the government was forced to pay and bought that plantation and put their own hands into that soil and grew pecans and oranges and grapes where cotton had been grown by people who owned nothing, not even themselves. They named it for resilience. They had earned the word the hard way. And on the land where the richest slaveholder in Georgia once counted human beings as property, black farmers worked ground that is, at last and against everything, their own.